What we're going to be going over here is direct and indirect, both fixed and variable manufacturing costs, and we're going to get an understanding of what these costs are and how we classify them. And generally, when you're talking about manufacturing costs, you're talking about labor, materials, and overhead. So let's just start with our direct manufacturing costs, and we're going to be looking at both fixed and variable direct manufacturing costs. So what we're doing here, we've got just a small little graph here. Typically, you have your cost along your y-axis here. Along your x-axis, you're going to have some activity here. So whatever's going on, some production activity increases across your x-axis here. And what you have is really you have two different components here when you're talking about direct manufacturing costs here, and both indirect and direct manufacturing costs. You're going to have a fixed component that's really a constant cost here. And it doesn't depend on any change in your production volume. It's going to be constant if you make very few units or a lot of units. So you just have a constant amount. So that's why we just call it fixed right across here. So then you're going to have also this variable direct manufacturing cost here, a variable component. This is where it changes with the production volume. So the more the product you make, the greater your variable costs are going to be. Okay, so let's start out here with typically what you'd have here in a factory or a plant operation when you're making a product. You're going to have a product routing here, and we're going to make the case here where it's a traceable cost here, and it's also a direct manufacturing cost. So what you'd have for your product routing for your particular product that you're making here, it would be going through any number of different departments in the factory. You'd have like a machining department, you could have a casting department, you could have a paint and finishing department, and then an assembly department, and so forth. But nonetheless, it's going to be going through all these departments here, and within each department you're going to have your direct labor and your direct material here. You're going to have a standard amount that you have assigned for that product. And then based on your production volume, you're going to have a certain quantity that you use for your direct labor and direct material. And based on your standard and your quantity used, you can determine a specific cost. So you can understand all these are traceable costs, because and then not only are they traceable costs because we can define exactly what the cost is for that product, it also is a variable cost because it changes with the production volume. The quantity increases, you have a greater variable cost here for your direct labor and direct material here. So you can understand, those are pretty easy to understand as far as your direct manufacturing and traceable and also being a variable cost. So now the next thing that we have to understand here is, in order to run this plant here, we're going to have a lot of supporting departments within the plant. And just to understand what they might be, like inspection, quality control, maintenance, purchasing, receiving, engineering, shipping, materials handling, inventory control, materials planning, and supervision. So the question is here, all these different departments here that are supporting that product or those products within the plant, you have to ask, are they variable, or do they have a variable and fixed component that is related to the direct manufacturing, or are they indirect costs? Well, they're really all three of these here, but it depends how you want to define it and how you want to set up your costing here, your direct manufacturing costs. And the argument that's being made is that a portion of these departments here have to, and a certain number of people have to be in place in order for that plant to begin manufacturing product. So with no product manufactured, you're still going to have these in place here. And as you increase your amount of product that your variable amount of the product that you're manufacturing, these costs are going to remain standard. But we'll go and get an understanding of that as well here. So the key is, are these traceable costs? Are they fixed or are they variable? The argument is they're traceable here because you need a certain amount of those supporting departments and personnel within those departments to before you can even begin manufacturing the product here. And we'll also make the argument that they're indirect costs, and sometimes they're indirect costs. And you can also make the argument, let's take the case here where there's a variable portion here to these products, or these supporting departments. Say, for example, looking at inspection or quality control, maintenance, receiving, shipping, material handling, inventory control. Those are all hands-on jobs that are maybe not directly traceable to the cost here, but they're traceable as far as the fixed cost here to start that plant and keep that plant going. But as your production volume increases, you may have to add more of the inspectors and maintenance personnel here, receiving, shipping personnel. You may have to increase those numbers of people here, so then they become really part of the variable. The increase, maybe you call them directly variable manufacturing costs. But then again, they're not directly touching, well, they're touching the product here, but they're not sitting on this product routing here as a traceable cost. That's what I'm saying here. So that's the case here where we're going to make the argument that they're a fixed direct manufacturing cost because we need them in place here to manufacture the product. So that's the only argument we're making. And also you can make the argument that a certain amount of them are indirect here. Often they look at it, for example, supervision, they talk about being an indirect cost, and obviously engineering and purchasing can be an indirect cost here. Some of the other ones here may be less indirect because they're really touching the product as the product goes through the plant. So really when you think about traceable cost, if you're touching that product, you're machining the product or assembling the product or going through a finishing department, if your hands are touching that product, then you could really truly say it's a direct manufacturing cost. Okay, so there are a lot of decisions that have to be made along those lines to determine whether they're variable, fixed, or indirect cost. Not to confuse the situation, but you can understand. The reason they call them a fixed manufacturing cost, they classify them as such, is because you're going to need these supporting departments and to maintain the plant here for manufacturing the product. So you're going to need a certain amount of those in place, regardless of how much of the product you make, you're going to need them in place. And then the other argument there is you have to look at these other costs here. For example, utilities, rent, plant and equipment, again, maintenance on plant and equipment, and you're going to have to decide if there's going to be some fixed or variable direct manufacturing costs there, or direct, or are these costs, are they direct or are they indirect? And many of them are. Now, the argument again is made this. They're going to say that there's a fixed portion here because you're going to have certain utilities, you've got to have certain electricity, heat, and lights and so forth to manage that plant or keep that plant going. It has to be in place here before you can even make any product. So the argument is it's going to be a direct manufacturing cost for a certain amount of utilities. And again, rents here, you're going to have those. And they're looking at those being, longer than 1 year or more here. And then you're going to have your plant and equipment maintained here, even at some level, even if you're making little or no product here. And then you've got all those tooling costs and what have you. So really, again, there's a certain amount of direct manufacturing costs that are involved here, but then they'll also argue that there's a lot of indirect costs as well, and both fixed and variable portions. So when we talk about fixed portion here for utilities, that's just to keep the plant going, you're going to have a certain fixed amount of utilities. But as your production increases, for example, you use more electricity in the plant, it becomes increases with the production volume here. It becomes a variable amount here. So you can understand there's a whole lot going on here, and it's really not, it depends how you want to set up your operation here and see how to set your plant and your costing. What are you going to assign to your direct manufacturing costs here, even if they appear to be sort of indirect costs because they're not exactly traceable to the product here. But they'll say it's traceable because of the overall plant operation. So that's the argument made here. This product routing, this is traceable to the specific product you're making, and that's really what you're talking about for direct manufacturing costs. But your supporting departments, they're traceable only in fact here for the overall manufacturing of those products. Okay, so those are decisions that you have to make here just to give you some understanding. Then there's one other thing with these fixed costs here. They call them relevant ranges here. You're going to have a fixed cost, but you can see a step up here in cost. It's going to be fixed over a certain range here. And what they're really talking about is if you're getting a plant operation here and you increase your production to the point where you're going to have to add in more equipment or buy more equipment, that it's going to increase your fixed cost. And then you could look at it for things that you really have no control over, taxes, property taxes, and so forth, that would also be increasing your fixed cost, or you'd have to have a jump up. So really, the relevant range, make a point of that. Your fixed costs aren't always fixed, they're fixed only over a certain amount of production. But if your production increases to the point where you have to add in a lot of new equipment or expand your plant, then you're going to have a greater fixed cost. Okay, so that pretty much takes care of our direct manufacturing costs here, looking both fixed and variable. I hope it isn't confusing, but it's not always cut and dried as it may appear here. There has to be some, depends on the products you're manufacturing and the type of products you're manufacturing and just how you set your operation up here. But nonetheless, just understand here, your variable costs here change with increase with the change in production volume, and usually those will be generally direct materials or direct labor and direct materials. Those would be really the traceable cost here. And then you got these fixed or this constant cost here, and it's constant over. It really isn't affected by the change in your production volume, and those really pertain to all those supporting departments. Okay, so now let's go over here. Now let's look at our indirect manufacturing and what they refer to as overhead costs. Again, we have fixed and variable indirect costs here. We already discussed some of those indirect costs regarding those supporting departments and so forth. But anyway, again, when they talk about variable, again, the same graph. You get cross, it increases with the activity. You have greater production, you're going to have a greater variable indirect cost. And this is the key here. And they don't always have to be linear. You'll see usually linear. There may be some odd shaped here where they're concave up, concave down, so forth. But they change not in a linear, but they change in some fashion. I'm just pointing that out. Now, one here. The variable indirect costs, they change with the level of activity or production here. So that's understandable. And secondly here, they're related to the product, but they cannot be directly traced to the product set. That is, when you go through that routing, that product routing here, you don't see these variable indirect costs listed on your product routing. You're going to have really your direct costs. So these are really, they're not directly traceable, but yet they are assignable here as indirect costs. And then we have variable indirect costs, and then we have the semi-variable indirect costs. That's where each of them has a fixed component here and also a variable component. So the fixed indirect is really constant here. It does not change with any activity level or production level here. It's changed. So now let's go in and let's go through a list here for each of these. Okay, so here we're going to look at the type of overhead, or when we talk about overhead, those are those indirect costs here. So we got the variable, we'll look at our variable indirect and also our fixed indirect here, and we refer to them as overhead. So what would typically be in your variable overhead here, you'd have indirect materials, indirect labor, overtime premiums, repairs and maintenances, utilities, unemployment, all those taxes, idle time, FICA taxes, vacation and holidays, pensions, hospitalization insurance, and so forth. And I could go over the same thing here for the fixed overhead. They would have many of the same components, and we'll look at them. But in what is different here, fixed overhead, what I've got labeled here, what would be different here would be like depreciation expense here and property taxes. And then supervisors' salaries here, they have in the fixed overhead. The argument was made with those supervisors' salary here. They were a direct manufacturing cost if you look at them in terms of that plant not being, these people have to be in place here to run that plant here. But generally, their supervisors' salaries and so forth, and all those engineering salaries and purchasing department salaries here, they would be part of the fixed overhead portion. Okay, and then what would be the same here if we just look at them, the variable, and the reason we're talking about you're going to have both variable indirect labor here and fixed indirect labor was that fixed portion that you looked at. You had to have a certain amount in place here to keep that operation going here. But the variable amount of indirect labor, that's when your production increases. And then these other things, repairs and maintenance, variable and fixed portions again here. Same variable amount here. It increases with production. Let's say when we talked about variable and just that indirect labor here, the more production we produced, we had to have more indirect labor. Where with just to keep the place and going here, we call it a fixed overhead. So we have to just have that in place here, and it stayed constant. So you can see there is some confusion here when you're talking about fixed and variable overheads here. Again, it's because how you want to classify your variable portion here based on changes in production versus your fixed amount here for that's needed. You have to have in place just to keep the plant or operation going. And then you can see here utilities variable, and then utilities fixed portion here because you needed a certain amount of utilities just to keep that plant going. Without any really production, you have to have them going, use utility, electrical, heat, and so forth without making any production product. But as you increase that production here, you're going to increase the utilities you need here, the electricity and so forth. And then we talked about supervisor salaries, depreciation being part of fixed, property insurance here being property taxes. Those are all being part of the fixed overhead. They are in place. They do not change with the level of production. That's what we're saying here with fixed overhead. This here doesn't change with the level of production, whereas our variable overhead, that changes with the level of production. And then you see all those other taxes here, and that's taxes and holiday pays and pensions and so forth. The idea here is that in variable overhead it's included because those would be the production workers or the direct labor of people that would be working directly on the product, and they say that they are kind of replaceable here, whereas the people here, the supervisors and those people here aren't replaceable. They are constant over for whatever production you have. You're going to have those people on the payroll regardless, whereas your other workers here aren't. So all the taxes and pensions and so forth are shorted with your direct labor here are considered variable, whereas with the fixed amount here, they're in place and they have a fixed amount. Okay, so that pretty much goes over our list here just so you get the understanding of type of overhead, your indirect cost that you'd be included. Okay, so we've talked about that. Just remember there is both, and we can go back up here. Variable indirect, that's where the case is here where we had no production. We started out at a zero cost, and it increases here with the changes in their activity or production level, it increases. And then we had the semi-variable, which really was our fixed indirect cost here in our variable indirect cost. So you have some fixed portion here. They call it a semi-variable, but you want a fixed indirect portion here, fixed indirect, and then your variable indirect here. So that starts out. You got a certain fixed portion here just to keep that plant going or that operation going here. And then the variable is what changes with the level of production. Okay, so that's that. Let's go and then look at one last thing here. Okay, so this is a typical matrix that you would have here. And what they've done here is you just take what you want to do is in order to use this effectively, you want to fill your matrix out here. It's a 2x2 matrix. So across your top here, you'll have your assignment of your cost to the product. So your product costs, and usually they call it a cost object or something like that, but cost to the product, you're going to have your direct costs here and your indirect cost. And then along over here, this is the cost behavior pattern, as they call it. Either it's a fixed cost or a variable cost. So you can just, and that's what we discussed here, the assignment of cost. So our direct cost, for example, we would have, looking at a direct variable or variable direct or direct variable cost, that would be like our direct labor and direct material used in the in your manufacturing the product, because as you use more, your product increases here, your production volume increases, you're going to have to increase your direct labor and your direct material. So it's a direct cost. These people are actually the costs are directly traceable to the product here, but it's also variable because it varies with the amount of production. You need more direct labor and more direct materials here with an increase in production. Okay, so that's for our direct variable. And then looking at our indirect cost here, a variable indirect or indirect variable cost, however you want to look at it, those would be our plant utilities, electricity, and so forth. So as it's an indirect cost here, but it's variable because as your production increases, you're going to need more of these utilities here. So that's where they get the indirect cost variable. We looked at them also as really a part of the direct manufacturing cost, just as an overall plant operation here, just to get that plant in place before you even built anything. But nonetheless, they're generally, you refer to them as an indirect cost and a variable cost. So you have to identify your indirect and your variable cost. And then going back to our direct costs here, a direct fixed cost here, those would be like our supervisor's salaries here. It's a direct cost. They're saying that the people are directly involved here with the product, and they're fixed here because you're going to keep these people on here regardless. Whereas the direct laborers, you can lay them off or move them around or so forth, but supervisors, they're going to be in place. So you call them a direct fixed cost. And then for our indirect fixed cost, those would be like rents and lease and costs, those type of costs here. So you can't directly tie them in. They're not directly traceable to the product, so we call them an indirect cost, but yet they're fixed because you're going to have these costs. You're going to have to pay the rents and the leases and so forth on the product, regardless if you make few or no just zero products or a whole lot of the product here. All right, so this little matrix here can come in handy just so you understand you're going to have a direct variable cost here. Cost pattern is the fact that it's variable, and you're going to have an indirect variable cost here, and your direct fixed cost, and also an indirect fixed cost. So just a handy little matrix that you can use here in you're trying to classify how you classify your product costs. Okay, so that'll pretty much end our discussion.